Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Tuesday, we have entered the month of December. Today is the first day of December in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you on this, our second consecutive day this week of live broadcast here at the Virtual Center. I welcome you to the program. I thank you for your continued support of this program and of the Head On Radio Network as well. I really do thank you. I know that at the close of the program yesterday I mentioned, and I'm certain that Bob Kincaid did in his program last night, that last week was a different week here for a number of reasons, with Bob doing some filling in on the Mike Malloy program, and the hours changed, and we didn't, of course, have the nightly pitch for operating funds that I know we usually have, and so last week kind of put the Head On folks in a bit of a financial hole, but I know that the supporters of the network will do all they can do to pull it out. I just wanted to try to put my 2 cents worth behind that and encourage all of you to, as we approach this season, and we're in this season of giving, to keep in mind that it's so important to keep this kind of programming on the air. I really do believe. As we go through these programs through the weeks and months, I become more convinced than ever as to how important this program and this network is to the future of this nation. I really believe that. I think we have an absolute gem of an opportunity here in this effort, and I think we would rue the day that we ever let it get away from us. So I hope we'll never do that. I do invite you to share your thoughts and your ideas with us, because we would love to get your input on some of our program. We began a theme yesterday that I want to pursue in a lot more depth today. And actually, as I've been going through it, I'm kind of seeing that we probably won't finish it today either. I'm guessing that this particular issue will take us into tomorrow's program as well. However, I would point out in justification for that this issue clearly is so significant and so important that I believe it's one that all of us would be well put to spend our time reflecting upon and thinking about. For me personally, it's not a new issue. I can remember seeing it some years ago. We're talking about the issue, the growth of the so-called administrative state. And of course, in over the years in my study of history, American history, I've run into this before, and I've run into flags that people put up in years past about the dangers of the growth of the administrative state. But for the most part, most of these flags were just that, flags. And now there's a renewed concern, and we raised it yesterday, and we'll continue to pursue it today and tomorrow. I remind you to, if you have a comment you would like to share with us, with me personally, and I know that a lot of people are a little bit reluctant to go on the air, and I understand that, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. WAObrien, 906 @gmail.com. I also do invite you to check in on our Facebook page, which we've had now for 2 or 3 months. Just go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will gain access to our Facebook page. And again, there are quite a bit of issues and items on there. There will be more. I will continue to add to the page as we go. I know for certain that some of the issues on this related to this topic of the growth of the administrative state will be on there. So, I do fully intend to put some of this on Facebook, because I really believe that some of the folks that I communicate regularly with on Facebook, that for one reason or another are not regular listeners to the Virtual Center, might be, if I can jog them with some of these more important issues, and I do believe that this is one. I've mentioned several times that the reason that we begin 1/2 hour late on Tuesdays here at the Virtual Center is because, as a member of the local Rotary Club, the Beckley Rotary Club here, we have our weekly meetings at noon on Tuesdays, and the program doesn't end until 1 p.m. And so for me to take the time to get the car and get home from the weekly meeting and get set up to do our program takes a while. So consequently, we've been beginning our programs on Tuesdays 1/2 hour later. We do make it up a little bit in that, for the most part, we've been able to avoid taking our regular break. We just go through, for the most part, on Tuesdays for the full 90 minutes of the program. Some days we have to change that, because I'm not ashamed to say that as my age increases, my ability to withstand longer and longer times without a visit to the boys' room becomes a little bit more difficult. So, but for the most part, we've been able to do our Tuesday programs right through from beginning to end, and I kind of anticipate that might be the case as well today. Again, before we begin today's program, I just wanted to say how grateful and appreciative I am of your willingness to continue to show your support for this program and for the Head On Radio Network itself. I thank you so very much. I want you to know that I'll be forever appreciative of the support that I continue to receive from you, our listeners, our participants. And it spurs me on. It keeps me reading. It keeps me thinking. And I didn't anticipate it, and I am so excited to have it at this point in my life. I oftentimes think, if I could have had something like this 50 years ago, or 35, even 30 years ago, what might I have been able to do with it? But it seems to me putting a negative spin on a very positive thing. So the fact of the matter is, I continue the fact that we do have the Virtual Center now. I consider that as a blessing and an opportunity and a challenge. And I look upon all of those things in the most positive way possible, and I have you to thank for it, and I want to make sure that I regularly do that. I mentioned the Rotary Club meeting that we have on Tuesdays. Today's meeting was one that particularly fired me up. I'll tell you a little bit about it and about the speaker, and I'd like to perhaps take a few moments at the beginning of today's program to share with you some of the information that was shared with us in this presentation today. And I'm speaking totally from memory, because I just sat there and listened to the presentation from 12:30 to 1 p.m. today, so it was about less than 1 hour ago, or just 1 hour ago, and I don't have notes, so I'm just kind of flying by memory here, but I thought it was one of the most pertinent and relevant programs that we've had in our Rotary Club for a long time. The presenter was John Deskins. John Deskins is an economic statistician with West Virginia University here in West Virginia. And basically what he was doing was giving us the latest data on the West Virginia economy. And of course connecting it in some of the graphs that he's put together, some of the flow charts that he's put together, comparing it with the nation's economy as a whole, comparing the state of West Virginia's with the nation's as a whole. And of course going in, we know that the news is not going to be good. I think everybody in the room knew that. But at the same time, when you see the numbers, the hard data, it really begins to really get you thinking and begins to fire you up. And we got a lot of numbers to demonstrate the decline in coal production in southern West Virginia, what it's done to the economy generally, what it's done to jobs, what's happening to the state budget, with the decline in coal severance taxes to the state, the fact that in the last couple of years, the natural gas glut or boom that we were experiencing here in West Virginia, which for a time offset the decline in coal. In fact, many people believe, and that was the presentation today, that one of the reasons for the decline in coal, of course, was the explosion in natural gas development in this state and in other states as well. But the fact of the matter is, in looking at it from the perspective of the state budget, over the last couple of years until now, there's been little perceptible change because gas severance taxes tended to offset the decline in coal severance taxes. And so for purposes of those who didn't look carefully, there seemed to be no change. The fact of the matter is now the West Virginia budget, because of the decline in natural gas production and the continuing decline in coal production, is being reflected in a state budget which our former chair of the House Finance Committee, Bob Kiss, for many years, basically made a comment a couple of weeks ago that the West Virginia state budget was in free fall, because there was no question that the severance taxes are going down, 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 and how low it'll go and how far down the ladder will go at the point that he was speaking was a little bit unclear. All we know is it's going to be bad. And of course, it's already being reflected in substantial cuts in retirement benefits for state employees, which obviously, affects me personally, and health benefits and all the rest of it. So, obviously this is a real hot issue. And I think, the Rotary Club is comprised mainly of the business leaders in this community, and in southern West Virginia, as far as whatever economic potential there is, was in the room today, because the business leaders in southern West Virginia were in this room today for this presentation. And so some of the comments and some of the questions, and there weren't that many questions because the presentation brought the speaker right up to his time, but there were a couple. And one of them stuck out with me, and it's on my mind, and it's one of the ones I want to share. One of the folks in the room raised his hand and pointed out that he came to West Virginia 35 years ago. He heads a child protective agency here, a not-for-profit agency to protect children. And and he came here 35 years ago, and one of the things he mentioned was that when he came here from New England, he remembers 35 years ago that people were saying that coal production in southern West Virginia probably has about 25 to 30 years left before coal production is going to begin to decline in this particular part of the state. Part of the reason for that is that it was being mined at such a rate, the economy in coal was booming at such a rate that the coal that was easiest to mine was being taken out at a rate faster than it had ever been mined before. So logically, what we're facing here, and I don't think a lot of people think about this, is that the available coal in this region that was the easiest to mine has already been mined. And consequently, that means that the coal that is left here is much more difficult, much more expensive to extract than what was being mined earlier. Consequently, because of that increase in cost, coal users tend to look elsewhere for their coal. And so the fact of the matter is, as the speaker today made the point, southern West Virginia coal actually is better coal. And so the catch-22 here is that's part of the problem. People preferred it over these other areas, but now the name of the game has changed because it's so expensive to mine what coal is left here in southern West Virginia. Anyway, back to the point. The question was, 35 years ago, this fella commented, he was reading, people were saying that coal has 25 to 30 good years left before we're going to start running into problems. And so his question was, why is it that all of a sudden people are scurrying around as if this is news, that this is information that we didn't have before? And he said, I'm not even in the industry, and I had it 35 years ago. So the message that he felt that he was receiving 35 years ago was that the leaders of the state and the people who really affect the economy most directly need to begin to provide for and make the kinds of changes that are going to be necessary to deal with the decline in coal, which clearly is coming in 25 to 30 years. Well, now it's here. And what we're dealing with is an economy which has made absolutely no provision at all to deal with this eventuality. And what has happened instead is that the vitriol, the anger in this region for the decline in coal jobs and all the spin-offs from that is being directed at the EPA and at the Obama administration for this presumed war on coal. Obviously, what we're seeing here is a classic example of scapegoating. Like, just as Hitler used gays and Jews in Germany to explain all of Germany's problems, to justify or pin or blame for all of the problems that existed in Germany in the late 20s and early 30s. So now the Obama administration is being blamed for many of the problems here, which the people who were responsible for doing something about those problems never allowed themselves, were never willing to do. And of course, what's happening is many of these people are standing in the background and allowing all the anger and all the discord to be directed in the wrong place, because at least it's not going to them. And the fact that it should be. Before we went on the air just a moment ago, Bob Kincaid and I were chatting. And when I made this point to Bob, he pointed out all the governors that have been in office over the last 35 years. Rockefeller, Arch Moore, Joe Manchin, Bob Wise, Governor Underwood, on and on and on. And none of these people, even though all the data was there, the stories were being written about what was going to happen, none of these people would take on the powers that be in the state at that time, which was coal, and demand the kind of diversification in the economy that would prepare the region for the economic devastation that it's currently experiencing. And you know, he points out he pointed out in his presentation today that southern West Virginia is experiencing kind of a perfect storm, in that a number of issues have come together at the same time to make the situation worse. The fact that the world economy has slowed down substantially. The Chinese and Indian market have slowed down. The use of coal has slowed down. I saw a report on the CBS News a couple of nights ago about the pollution, the air pollution in Beijing, that's causing the people on the streets to wear masks. So obviously the Chinese government is trying to do something, because their economic development has been fueled almost exclusively up to this point by coal, and the pollution results are devastating. So the economies have slowed down, which has really caused a decline in our export markets. The strength of the American dollar is hurting exports. the rise of natural gas production basically offset or fueled the decline in coal. It became such a positive alternative for many users of coal. Many electricity producers abandoned coal in favor of natural gas. And then the process that we just talked about, which is the mining of the coal itself, all of those things have come together to create what he called a perfect storm. But again, one of the pieces of data that stuck in my mind was this statistic on GDP, the one that took energy out of the picture. And what it suggests is that if you exclude energy and you look at West Virginia's gross domestic product over the last several years, when measured against the national GDP, what you begin to see when you exclude energy from that data is that the West Virginia economy for the last 5 years has not moved. There has been absolutely no change from year to year, except in the areas of energy. What that suggests is a state whose leaders has buried their head in the sand, have refused to deal with the realities of what was going on. In other words, they basically squandered their responsibilities of leadership. They have allowed themselves to become the doers as well as the listeners of special interests, those who had no interest in change, those who were willing to milk the status quo as far as they could ride it, and the citizens of the region are paying the price. It's a story that needs to be told. It needs to be told over and over again, it seems to me. But anyway, so that's the presentation. Let me point out that much of the commentary on the presentation that I just made is my own. In other words, this commentary was not part of the presentation, the data was. One of the things that I've learned over the years about statisticians, about data analysts, is that they're very good at analyzing data and presenting it. But in terms of looking at the ramifications and long-term implications of the data they present, they usually try to avoid going in those directions. And I can understand some of that. But be that as it may, the presentation was excellent. And in terms of what needs to happen in order to begin to deal with the situation that this data suggests, it doesn't suggest that we're in, it tells us that we're in. One of the areas of particular interest was education and health. And again, this is where some of the education data that we've dealt with over the last couple of programs here at the Virtual Center comes in. West Virginia, and there were two pie charts that were presented today about the breakdown in income in the state. Income in the year 2000 and projected income in the year 2020. So in the current 20-year period from 2000 to 2020, there were two charts. And one of the numbers that really jumped out, and he commented on it, and I'm trying to recall it as well, was the degree, the income from people who work, as opposed to what the statisticians define or call transfer income. And this is the income from people that are on some sort of disability, Social Security, whatever, but are not contributing anything to the economy, to the growth. And the projections are that in The year 2020, 21% of West Virginia's income was transfer income. In 2020, that 21% is predicted to increase to 27%. 27% of a state's income in the area of transfer income. In a few counties, he made the comment, in a few counties, actually transfer income is greater than job income. There's more money coming into that county in transfer payments than there is generated by people who work. And in comparing these numbers with national data, you can begin to see how substantially behind national levels this particular state is in these particular numbers. And of course, a few of the questions, comments at the end were directed, as they usually are, against those people who seem to be abusing the disability, because West Virginia's disability rates are obviously quite high. And the question was raised about those who are legitimately receiving disability as those who are illicitly receiving disability payments. And his answer, of course, which I think is the only answer he could give, but it bears repeating, is that when you're dealing in data, it's very hard to get data on disability payments that are not justified. How do you get data on the percentage or the numbers of people who are abusing the system? But the fact of the matter is, we all know that there are people who are doing that. The issue, of course, it seems to me, this is the issue that never comes up in the Q&As. But the biggest abuse of the system, I would suggest, is not coming from the people at the bottom who abuse it. The biggest abuse of all is in the people who did nothing to prepare the economy for this, who continued to extract from the status quo and do everything they could do to prevent the kinds of changes and the kinds of planning which would have enabled the state to be ready for some of these dramatic changes that are occurring in its economy. So again, I think, and that's a political and a social issue, is where the vitriol, where the anger, where the attention is pretty well directed. Naturally, those at the top do everything they can to direct attention toward those at the bottom who are abusing the system. And it's working, and it's very important, and we'll be dealing with that in coming programs in a number of ways. Anyway, before we get back to the topic at hand, which was the idea of the administrative state, I had to say that I found some of this data, eye-opening. It wasn't that it's a surprise, but the degree of trouble that the numbers tell us we're in sometimes is sobering. And I guess that's probably the response that I would give is probably the best way to explain it. Anyway, there's some real issues here, and I'm sure we'll be back to them in future years. One additional point, while it's on my mind, I want to share it with you because it won't stay on my mind long. Nothing seems to anymore. And it's tied up with the issue of disability. And the speaker, John Deskins, made this point. I thought it was one of the most perceptive points that he made. Actually, he made a couple. but this particular one was one that I thought was incredibly telling. I hadn't heard a lot of people make it before, and I think it's important. And what he's talking about is looking at disability from the perspective of an either-or situation. In other words, you either can work or you can't. And all of that is being driven by the nature of the economy that this particular region has been in for so long. Coal is a dangerous profession. Disability rates have always been high in this kind of an area because the work is so dangerous. But the fact of the matter is that work is disappearing. And there's no work to replace it. So the fact of the matter is many people who are currently listed as disabled may be disabled were they going to work in a dangerous industry like the mines. But if they were to be retrained and put in office positions or technology positions, they could become fully functional. The challenge is to make that change. The challenge is to get to these people and get them to realize that while they may not be able to take on dangerous physical work as was demanded of them before, they are in good enough shape, as it were, to become fully productive in less physical, less dangerous areas. But in order to take advantage of those opportunities, they need to be retrained. They need to be re-educated. And in order to do that, they need to come forward. So the question is, how do you get them to come forward? What is the incentive? And this is my point, not the speaker's. I'm adding this. How do you do that? Obviously, there are those who argue the way you do it is you take everybody off transfer income and you put people in the desperate position where they will voluntarily come forward and say, you need to train me to do something. I need to survive. I need to feed a family. I need to feed myself. I don't think that's humane. I really don't. The question is, how do you get people to come forward and be willing to take on the challenge of being retrained? And it seems to me there are two challenges associated with that. One is to make sure that there are employment opportunities available for people who are retrained. Recognizing, of course, that those opportunities will never be available unless you begin to retrain the workforce. In other words, the only reason that employment might come to the region is if there is a workforce able to perform. So you're dealing with kind of a chicken and egg thing, and it needs to be carefully managed. Obviously, it can't be managed by those who have let us down before. What we're talking about here is a whole new day. What we're talking about here is a totally new approach to education and re-education. What we've been talking about here in the last couple of programs about the uneducated and undereducated potential student body, student enrollment base that exists here in this region is involved in just this kind of challenge. I don't care how many colleges you bring in here, how many universities you bring into this region, how many times you choose to take the eligible student population of college enrollment that exists now And you can divide it up into I don't care how many times you divide it amongst the colleges here competing for these qualified potential students. The fact of the matter is, those that need to be re-educated and retrained and brought up to that level where they can benefit effectively from high quality college level education, that market is immense. That's the market that needs to be developed. That's the market that needs to be addressed. Our colleges and universities can't do it. They won't do it because they feel that their reputations as quality institutions in the field of higher education would not permit them to risk taking on the responsibility of vast numbers of underqualified students, whether they are potentially qualifiable or not. That's the challenge. And I think that's the challenge that needs to be addressed. So what we've got here is a couple of major issues, it seems to me. One is, how do you get people to come forward and willingly agree to be retrained? If they are receiving some sort of transfer payment now that they would lose should they come forward. So obviously the answer is, you've got to secure them from the danger of losing their current income in pursuit of an income that they might be able to acquire at some point in the future, but in fact may not come at all. It seems to me there used to be this idea, for example, that if you were on unemployment, if you were collecting unemployment insurance, you could not go to school. What we're talking about is a total change in mentality here. If you are unemployed and you're in the position of needing to find new, different employment, then that's exactly the time you need to be going to school. And unemployment insurance ought to be able to support you while you do that. These transfer payments ought to be able to support you while you do that. So somehow we need to find a way to turn the transfer income into investment income. Instead of looking at transfer income as permanent dependency for many of these people, we have got to begin to look at transfer income as an investment opportunity for career change. And somebody's got to take that on. As I mentioned, we had a group here in this region that thought we could do it and were willing to take it on. And to be very honest, and I don't want to become too political here, but we were kind of eased out of the room, as it were, when the university came in here. And as we exited, so also did our proposal. That proposal continues to exist. That opportunity is still here. There is a group of people, of professionals with years, with decades of experience in education and commitment to students who are willing to take this on. But the fact of the matter is, many of them are retired, which means their years of the ability to contribute to this kind of a community effort is limited. I worry about that. I worry about the fact that the opportunity may come too late. But be that as it may, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. One other factor that it seems to me to play into this is the national campaign for the $15 per hour minimum wage. If there was ever a reason to support that kind of an increase in the minimum wage, this is it. Looking at the minimum wage as exactly what it was originally intended to be, which is an investment in future education and future career and skills development. People could afford to take on career change challenges and the risks associated with career change if they knew that they could earn enough to survive on while they did it. And a $15 minimum wage would go a long way towards making that possible. These are the kinds of incentives that it seems to me we need to seriously consider in order to encourage many of the people involved to come forward and self-identify as people who see that they could become productive citizens in a vibrant economy if they didn't or weren't worried that they would lose what little they have by doing that. We've got to take away that threat, and we've got to do everything we can to encourage these people to come forward. I think the challenges are incredible, but at the same time, they are exciting. I think they are well worth our thought, well worth our reflection, because whatever answers we come up with that might work are going to be out-of-the-box answers, not in-the-box answers. And my final comment on the presentation that I experienced today was a comment from the presenter at the very end when he said, because of the data that he has been involved in any number of closed-door meetings with groups who have been speculating on addressing solutions, potential solutions to some of these issues. And the one common denominator, he said, that he continues to see is that most of these folks are unwilling to think out of the box. They're looking for solutions on the very fringes of the problems. They see getting into the problems any deeper than merely on the edge would produce such monumental challenges that they are reluctant to take them on. It seems to me that it's time to take on those challenges. I just took a quick gander at the clock, and we're at 14 minutes after the hour. So what we have effectively done is devote 50% of our 90-minute program today to this particular issue. We've been here for 45 minutes talking about this, and I thank you. I hope that you found it productive. For me, it's been very, very valuable because it's enabled me to put into perspective a lot of these numbers and a lot of this data that was kind of floating around in my head at the time. I think it's relevant. I think it's significant. I think it's what we're about here at the Virtual Center. And I hope that you agree as well. What I'd like to do now is flip or turn to a totally different topic, which is the one we began in yesterday's, toward the end of yesterday's program, on the issue of the growth of the administrative state. Let me repeat very quickly in order that we can begin to get into this, and then we can really spend the bulk of our time tomorrow, our full 2-hour program, on fleshing out some of the implications and some of the details of this particular issue, because I think it's significant. I think it's one that all of us need to be aware of. What prompted this issue, what got me thinking about this issue, was an article in Friday's Washington Post by George Will. And George Will was writing on this particular issue of the administrative state, and he was making specific reference to positions being taken in recent court decisions by Justice Clarence Thomas. I'll be very honest with you. One of the things that attracted me, that drew my attention to this, was the fact that it was Clarence Thomas. Because, like many of you, I guess, one of the things that the 25-year career of Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, it's hard to believe that he's been on there for 25 years, but his overall contributions, his overall visibility on the court has really bothered a lot of people, because he seems to be one of those go-along guys that seem to concur, or for those that ideologically agree with him, he'll go along with the dissents. But more often than not, he doesn't take the leadership in either the concurring opinions or the dissents. Many of his opinions on cases have been brief, have been rather restatements of positions and issues that others have put forth. There's not been all that new coming out of Clarence Thomas on the 25 years that he's been on the court, until this particular issue. And that's really what attracted my attention. This seems to be an issue that has really gotten the attention of Clarence Thomas, to the point that he's willing to come forward and do some things and say some things that I think are significant. Philosophically, ideologically, I'm quite aware that Clarence Thomas and I are probably at opposite ends of the political spectrum. I'm naturally inclined, with I'm guessing many of you, to not be all that excited about positions that Clarence Thomas would take on anything. I'm trying to be very honest here. One of the things we like to believe, and we hear often, is that we're never too old to learn. I think that over the last 3 to 5 days, I've experienced that phenomenon. Because in my research over the last 3 or 4 days on this particular issue, about the challenge being led principally by Clarence Thomas against the growth of the administrative state, I've come to recognize in Clarence Thomas skills and abilities and a degree of commitment that I hadn't seen before. And I've been forced to overcome my own mindset on some of these issues. I'm impressed. I knew that George Will, I understand why George Will would be impressed, because ideologically, of course, he and Clarence Thomas are pretty close. But the fact that I'm impressed, I think, is significant. And it's kind of, driven home to me, this idea about prejudging or being overly limited in our willingness to keep an open mind. I think all of us can continue to learn. There never comes a point when we reach that level where we can say, I've learned all I need to know. So with that, let's look a little bit into the issue at hand. And again, a little bit of this is review from yesterday, but we haven't gotten into any of the substance yet. And I think once we get into the substance, I think the significance of this particular issue will come to the fore. I think it'll be quite evidence. As I mentioned yesterday, because of the work that I've done in history and political science over the years, I'm not totally unaware of the issue of the so-called administrative state. I'm fully aware of the growth of bureaucracy. I can remember during my times in graduate school being very concerned about the growth and the expansion of bureaucracy. In fact, I can remember doing quite a bit of reading on the mentality that supports bureaucracy, the so-called bureaucratic mindset, if you will. I can remember in the 1950s reading some of the sociological and political studies that were coming out then about the mentalities of the administrative mind. Books by Vance Packard, if you remember. And other people who talked about the overemphasis on security that seemed to be driving talent in the 1950s. And the assumption was, the conclusion at the time was, that much of this was driven by the Depression of the 1930s. Many of the young people in the 1950s coming out of the war, coming back from the war, because you know we had the GI Bill in 1946, and many vets were going to college and getting college degrees and going into classrooms as a result. And many of the studies at the time attributed people's avoidance of risk as being directly attributable to the Depression. The fact that so many people had been wounded, had been wiped out in the 1930s. Businesses had failed. Suicides were up. All of these things that we know about. And so many parents of youngsters in the 1950s were adamant that their children would never experience the downfalls that they witnessed, that their parents had experienced. And so risk avoidance became a dominant theme in America in the 1950s. And with the growth of large corporations, many people saw the expansions of bureaucracy as a risk-free alternative, as a guarantee for security. Studies showed that people's development plans, if you will, self-improvement plans, were focused on finding a mid-level management position somewhere in the bureaucracy of some particular large corporation that was likely not to fail. That would probably be there for a while. And by getting some sort of white-collar, secure, bureaucratic position somewhere in the middle, it was felt that you could minimize the risk, the security risks, and guarantee yourself a stable income. It was the kind of an income, because white-collar jobs obviously paid more than blue-collar jobs there for a while. It was obviously a way that you could take advantage of raising a family and moving to the suburbs, buying a small place in the suburbs, the ideal Ward Cleaver kind of existence in Leave It to Beaver, the house in the suburbs with the white fence and the white picket fence and the garage, where you'd have, raise your children, have a dog, belong to the local community groups, become involved in your community, and live the kind of stable, secure, uneventful lives that many people hope to secure and whose parents especially wanted them to secure. And I can remember, because happened to be Leave It to Beaver was one of my favorite television programs when I was growing up in the 50s. And I can remember so much about it. The sessions when Ward would take Beaver into the library, close the door, and give him the lesson of the day. And his older brother, Wally, who was the ideal son, excellent student, good-looking kid, who had no trouble getting girls to date, Beaver was the one that was constantly in trouble. But the most interesting thing, of course, besides the fact that in the middle of the week, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, Ward would be there to give one of his lectures to Beaver, always dressed in a white shirt and tie, of course. But that was okay because June was always in heels and always ready to go out to dinner at the drop of a hat, so to speak. So it was the ideal existence of life, middle-class life in the 1950s. We know, of course, that there were an awful lot of people in this country who were unable to achieve that standard of living, that lifestyle. But it became the ideal. But what I wanted to emphasize is the issue of bureaucracy itself. The security and the safety that existed within bureaucracy. And people were reading the sociological studies of bureaucracy and bureaucratic growth. Max Weber and all the other sociological studies that were associated with the idea of bureaucracy and the growth of institutions in a society. And we talked a little bit about institutions before, and the extent to which institutions have their own ways, their own system of governance, their own structure, as it were. And there are certain behaviors which are expected in order for the institution to run smoothly. So therefore, there are certain behaviors that are rewarded and certain behaviors that are discouraged and punished. And over time, by growing up within a system, as it were, one begins to learn the rules of acceptable behavior as opposed to unacceptable behavior. And this kind of bureaucratic structure included within it its own system of accountability, its own system of responsibility. And so therefore, by layering responsibilities from the bottom to the top, in theory, the traditional bureaucratic structure was like a pyramid. And at the very top would be the president of the corporation or the CEO, whatever you might like to call it, and his immediate staff. And each of those staff members would have a number of people who reported to them, who had specific responsibilities to do in their areas of responsibility. And the flow chart, and I think everybody, if you can imagine any kind of a business or any kind of an organization that you haven't ever had an opportunity to look at that particular institution's flow charts, you can begin to see what I mean. That the flow chart would grow and grow and grow, and there would be committees and subcommittees and sub-subcommittees and all of that until you got to the very bottom, where the people at the very bottom didn't have, they were not responsible for supervising anybody. And you had shift managers, and you had foremen, and you had all of these structures. Success was moving up the ladder. And to do that, you had to have positive job performance reviews by your supervisor. And the emphasis all through the 60s and 70s, the emphasis in corporate America was in understanding the nature of the organizational flowchart. Who reports to who to whom? Who's accountable to whom? Who supervises whom? Not doing end runs, not operating outside the system. In other words, you did not go to the president's office and stand outside on a Monday morning to report something to go on in your business. The theory was that you worked your problems through the system. You took your concerns to the appropriate person directly above you who could do something about it. And if that person couldn't do something about it, then they went to their supervisors and on up the line until you reached the level of somebody that had the authority as well as the will to do something constructive to address this problem. And so the reality is, as we know, and these are the negatives, as bureaucracy developed, it tended to become very rigid, very cold, and very structured. And as we know, many things ended up getting lost in the system. And the rules of the system was so rigid and so important because if you didn't follow the rules, the whole system would break down. So consequently, it was very difficult for what Thomas Kuhn called anomalies, oddities, things that occurred that you didn't expect. It was very difficult for those things to access the bureaucratic system. Or to find their way to solutions. Issues tended to get in the bureaucracy and get lost there. They never seemed to see the light of day ever again. Some critics began to argue that that was really one of the points of bureaucracy. The purpose of bureaucracy was not to efficiently and effectively solve problems. Rather, the purpose of bureaucracy was to create the illusion of solution, but in reality to lose the problem. On the theory that if it was caught up in bureaucratic red tape for long enough, the problem itself would disappear. It would go away. And that was problem solving at the time. Many people believed that problem solving was taken care of by immediately presenting the problem to the person who was being paid to solve it. Kicking the can down the road. Kicking the problem upstairs, as it were. Not stepping out of your bounds. Not, the expression, I still hear it along a number of times. I know there's a real problem there, but it's above my pay grade. In other words, it's something I'm not being paid to deal with. I'm not being paid enough to assume the responsibility for solving a problem that complex. And all of this is a throwback to the old idea of bureaucracy and bureaucratic structure. So the fact of the matter is, many individuals believed that the ideal career was finding a way to secure a stable position within this kind of bureaucratic structure. You knew the rules. There were no surprises. Each day was like the previous one. Each week was going to be just like the next one. Everything was predictable. Nothing changed. The important thing seems to get done. The less important things seem to disappear. And everything seemed to be fine. Well, the fact of the matter is that was kind of what middle class ideal life in the late 20th century was all about. the fact of the matter is something else was going on during this period. And this is what George Will writes about. And that is that more and more of the nation's problems tended to be flowing toward government for solution. Government itself was increasingly becoming the problem solver in more and more areas. People were being encouraged to look to government to solve their problems more and more than ever before. And the result was that in order to handle these problems, government needed to have on staff the expertise necessary to address a variety of problems that from years ago, few could ever have anticipated that government would be addressing at all. So as bureaucracies expanded within the private sector, bureaucracy was also expanding in the public sector. And the same kind of bureaucratic growth was occurring in the public sector. That increasingly became the place where the most lucrative job opportunities existed. People desired to secure federal employment or state employment or municipal employment, or to work at city hall or town hall. Securing those kinds of positions provided the optimum level of security and stability. The benefits were good. The job was clean. The working environments were safe. The jobs paid pretty well. And through the process, government became not only larger, but more and more expensive. But increasingly, the assumption was, or the thinking was, that if people expect more and more service from government, then they need to pay for it. And so taxes continued to go up as the size of government expanded. And we know ultimately much of what happened as a result of that. And much of the conservative movement today, of course, is emerged because of this incredible exponential growth in the size of government and the cost of government and the overall strength and power which government decision-making presents in today's world. That's really the issue that George Will writes about, namely the growth or the expansion of the administrative state. And what he is particularly drawing on the judicial opinions of Clarence Thomas about is that in a number of decisions, 4 specific decisions within the last Supreme Court session, the 2013-2014 session, Clarence Thomas, in 4 cases, began to elaborate his research and his concerns on the extent to which the growth and performance of the administrative state was increasingly in violation of the Constitution of the United States. And this, of course, is the virtual center for the study of the Constitution. So this particular issue, it seems to me, is right there for us, and we do well to take it on. George Will makes the point, and I'll get into the source of George Will's writing in a moment, because I think the article by Charles Cooper is really the source of George Will's writing, and that particular article is the one that I would like to focus most of our attention on in terms for specifics here. But the basic issue goes back to the founders. And we know, because of our work and our time here at the Virtual Center, that Madison's structure, as outlined in Federalist Number 10 and as elaborated in Federalist Number 51, is driven by the checks, the internal checks created by what we call the system of checks, separation of powers. The idea of separating the functions of government into the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The legislative session makes law, makes policy, debates, discusses, compromises, negotiates, deliberates, and ultimately makes policy, writes law. The executive branch carries out, executes the law. The judicial branch, as John Marshall said in one of his earlier decisions in 1819, the Supreme Court determines what the law is. It's the Supreme Court's job to look at statute law and weigh it against fundamental law, against the Constitution, in order to decide whether in fact what we are doing, what laws are passed, what policies we are following, are consistent with or out of balance with the Constitution of the United States. Clarence Thomas's concern is that with the growth of the administrative state, the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, well, in terms of the federal government, but government bureaucracy generally, has resulted in the growth of a number of federal agencies. I think we looked at the Cooper article yesterday, and Cooper mentions there are 450 federal agencies that in total employ more than 2.7 million federal employees. What bothers Thomas is that many of these agencies, while they are creations of the executive branch of government, and while in theory they report or they are accountable to the President of the United States as chief executive, the fact of the matter is many of these agencies exert power which goes well beyond the legitimate right of the executive branch to execute law. That in fact many of these agencies have been conceded the power to make law and to evaluate the limits of their own lawmaking ability. In other words, what Clarence Thomas argues is that the administrative state has effectively emasculated, has destroyed the separation of powers which James Madison and the other creators and supporters of the Constitution believed was so important to the governance of this nation and to the freedom of its citizens. That's really the issue. Thomas's argument, how do we go about reversing the trend? How do we go about restoring the checks and balances which the founders believed was so critical to the operations of this republic and to the freedom of its citizens. That's the issue. That's the challenge. I think it is a real one. I think all of us who have thought seriously about government in the past would have to admit that they have concerns about it as well. The principal debate, it seems to me, between liberals and conservatives today is driven, at least in part, by this particular issue. Liberals believe that government's responsibility to govern in the public interest necessitates the kind of expansion in power into different areas that maybe government was not initially involved in order to measure and balance the countervailing forces in society, in order to make sure that the public interest is promoted and protected. Conservatives, on the other hand, believe that the very ability of government to govern presents a problem. What they point out is that the separation of powers system that Madison created for the Constitution of the United States was designed to render government's ability to govern difficult. The fact that government would not and could not function efficiently to the founders was not a problem, it was a strength. Because the idea was that so long as government couldn't govern, couldn't take advantage of the powers that it had at its disposal, the results of its inability to govern guaranteed the freedom of citizens themselves. And it goes back to this old idea that we've talked about this numerous times about the inherent clash between freedom and order. The more government is able to preserve order and freedom and order and security and stability, the more government can effectively govern, the more that is at the expense of the freedom of operation of citizens. That government power and individual freedom are disproportional to each other. As one increases, the other must decrease. And conservatives always put the emphasis on the freedom of the individual, which necessitates their push to restrict and limit the effectiveness of government. So when Clarence Thomas talks about reestablishing the viability of separation of powers in our system, what he is really talking about is restraining the ability of government to govern in the interests of individual freedom. I think it's important to recognize that. Before we get into the details of this particular study, in order to really understand the issues, I think it's important to appreciate the agendas that are associated with those who take particular positions on this issue. It's important to recognize that as you begin to look at the negatives and the problems associated with the growth of the administrative state, it's very easy to forget or to overlook the fact that there is a political agenda associated here. And the political agenda is the current contemporary world we live in. The America, the nation that we live in. Somebody's going to govern. The illusion that there's a possibility to maintain a society without government is an illusion. The idea that man can reestablish total freedom as man had it in John Locke's State of Nature is illusory. It doesn't exist. John Locke's State of Nature never really existed. It's merely a creation for the purposes of argument. So therefore, it's important to recognize that ideally there's got to become some sort of a flexible balance between government's ability to govern on the one hand and limitations on individual freedom on the other. Too much in one direction can produce autocracy and take freedom away totally. Too much freedom in the other produces chaos. And so it seems to me that there needs to be some sort of a balance, but at the same time, in order to be effective, it needs to be somewhat flexible. If you talk about restoring a position or a situation where separation of powers was dominant as it was conceptualized in Madison's Federalist Number 10, or as he explained in Number 51, by pitting ambition against ambition, by creating this internal system which made effective government very, very difficult. If you are successful in re-implementing that kind of a system, in restoring separation of powers to the premier place that the founders envisioned it ought to be, then you are effectively rendering government unable to govern. But the reality is somebody's going to govern. And the issue is whom? Who is going to be the recipient of this flow of power? If the ability to govern leaves government, where's it going to go? It's important to understand that that George Wills and Clarence Thomases of the world want the outcome of that process to be the outcome. They are not talking about restoring separation of powers and then saying that now we got to figure out what's going to happen. They have taken their thinking well beyond the restoration of separation of powers to what it would lead to. And what it would lead to, it seems to me, we are seeing all around us in the influence of big money and corporate money in our election systems. We are seeing the flow of power to big money, to wealth. We are seeing all of that. So if you don't want government to govern, then you want that to. You want them to. It's important to recognize that. So as you deal with the innards, with the internal arguments, it's important to keep an eye on the overall outcomes and to recognize that those most involved in this have a stake, have skin in the game, so to speak. And I think it's important to recognize that. I know we're getting close to the end of our program. I've got 56 minutes after the hour, so we're going to have to kind of wind down here. And I think it's important that we do that. Let me point out to you. This is a quotation from one of the 4 concurring opinions that Clarence Thomas issued during this past session on this particular issue. Clarence Thomas said, "When courts refuse even to decide what the best interpretation is under the law, they abandon the judicial check, the judicial system of checks and balances. That abandonment permits precisely the accumulation of government power that the framers warned us against. And the dangers inherent in ceding judicial power to the administrative state cannot be justified by the need for expertise." And then Thomas goes on and issues the following. Deference amounts to a transfer of a judge's exercise of an interpretive judgment to an agency. But that agency, as part of the executive branch, lacks the structural protections for independent judgment adopted by the framers, including the life tenure and salary protections of Article 3. Because the agency is thus not properly constituted to exercise the judicial function under the Constitution, the transfer of interpretive judgment raises serious separation of powers concerns, unquote. What Justice Thomas here is talking about is the very dangerous tendency of the courts in their decisions, of Congress, to defer more and more power to these executive agencies. In effect, they encompass all 3 kinds of power: executive, legislative, and judicial. In the interest of efficiency and effectiveness, they render separation of powers inoperable. And that's what bothers Clarence Thomas. And to a degree, I have to acknowledge, it also bothers me. So I think this is an issue that is very, very important, and it's one that we will do everything we can do to flesh out tomorrow. We've reached the end of our time together today. In fact, I've gone a little bit late. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful evening. Be good to each other, and we'll see you tomorrow.